Now, let's get to our special evening, which is the tour of Bushnell Basin Cemetery. All right, well, let's do it the easy way. Many people have asked me, where the heck is it? How many of you have ever actually seen Bushnell Basin Cemetery? Not very many, considering the number of people in this room. So, Bushnell Basin Cemetery, Route 96, in between Craig Road and Garnsey Road, south side of the street. It is set very far back. And if you're whizzing by at 50 or more miles an hour, not that any of you speed, and neither do I, because that wouldn't be right, you would miss it. It is very easy to miss because it is set so far back. But there are about 250 people buried there from very early times in Fairport, sorry, wrong place. So, unfortunately, many of these stones are in bad shape. In fact, you'll see some tonight that are lying on the ground. You'll see some that are broken. It is being well maintained, and you can see that the grass has been cut. This is a recent picture that we took just last week, actually. But 250 people buried here from our very early settlers. So, one of my favorite things to talk about, besides Civil War people and cemeteries, is white bronze monuments. This cemetery happens to have 5 examples of this. And this was something, it was only made by one company in the United States, the Monumental Bronze Company of Bridgeport, Connecticut. And they started in 1874. They went out of business in 1939. And basically, they called them white bronze because that was an exciting thing, but they were actually pure zinc monuments. And you will recognize these monuments because when you walk up, the color is sort of a bluish gray. They're very different. And you can go and you can knock on these things, and they sound like metal. So, the Meese family has a white bronze monument at the cemetery. Unfortunately, because the cemetery is set so far back from the road, it has met with lots of vandalism. Very easy to get back there, no one can see you. And so this beautiful monument of white bronze has been really decimated up here by people trying to cave it in. But you would get these catalogs, and you would decide what kind of base you wanted and what kind of top you wanted. And then when the time came, you would order your personalization, and it would be screwed onto your monument. And there are many, many different examples. They had over 500 different variations of these white bronze monuments. And not all cemeteries have them. These are the other 3 examples. Beautiful, beautiful craftsmanship here. This one, another example of vandalism, sadly. But they're just gorgeous, and you will notice when you see them because the color is so very different from what you're used to seeing in the cemetery. And they're just beautiful, beautiful monuments. So 5 of these white bronze monuments in our cemetery. We're very proud of that. So our first person up is Mrs. Clarissa Simmons Richardson.
Good evening, and welcome to our cemetery tour. I'm Clarissa Simmons Richardson, the first eternal resident in Bushnell Basin Cemetery that you will hear from tonight. I'm also, sadly, the first person who was buried in our beautiful little cemetery, but we'll get to that later. I was born in 1802. Although I had a happy childhood, I'm going to tell you about my adult life with my husband, Gold Richardson. We owned a rather famous establishment in Bushnell Basin. Perhaps you've heard of it? Richardson Canal House. My husband and one of his brothers, Elias, originally built it as a coaching inn to provide a luxurious place for stagecoach travelers to stop on their way from Canandaigua to Rochester. The road you know now as Route 96 was built in 1812 as a stagecoach route. It was called Ketchum Road in our day. It quickly became a major travel route, and many farms, liveries, and inns sprang up along it. Gold and Elias built the inn around 1818. Gold and I got married in February of 1822, and after that, I helped keep the inn for several years. The Erie Canal was built around this time, and as you probably know, it was built east from Buffalo and west from Albany at the same time. One of the last stretches to be built was right here in town. Because the engineers couldn't figure out how to get the canal over to Irondequoit Creek, they finally came up with a plan. And the construction began on the Great Embankment. First, a stone culvert was built to carry the creek under the canal bed. The canal workmen used wheelbarrows to carry dirt from nearby hills and fields to construct the embankment. It was 65 feet high in places and reinforced with 900 logs. The canal bed itself was made of timbers and were reinforced with clay and stone. It took 2 years to finish. In the meantime, traffic traveling the canal in both directions had to leave the canal and transfer to the other side via wagons right here in the basin. There was plenty of activity and work, and plenty of paying customers too. Our inn was very busy. It was widely acknowledged to be the finest establishment between Albany and Buffalo. It had beautiful rooms, excellent food, and our dance floor even had springs in it to make dancing easier. Our beautiful inn was painted in the most lovely shade of yellow. It took 40 gallons of paint to get that way. When the canal finally opened here in 1825, the canal ran right in front of our place, which was convenient. The only drawback was that when the packet boats went by too fast, waves sloshed up right in the front door and flooded our bar room. It was a constant mess to clean up, and I think some of them actually did it on purpose. Can you imagine? When the canal was widened a decade or so later, the canal was moved behind the inn, which solved that problem. Out of curiosity, do you want to know why some places along the canal are called basins? They were places where the canal would be wider to allow boats to turn around. Fairport had several basins, including Bushnell's Basin and Fulham's Basin. But did you know that Bushnell's Basin wasn't originally called that? It was called Hartwell's Basin for a time, after Oliver Hartwell, who developed the area. But Mr. Hartwell sold it to Mr. William Bushnell, and it's his name that stuck for all these years. I guess it doesn't pay to be first, does it? In addition to working as innkeepers, Gold and Elias helped keep the town running. Back in those early days, you didn't have DPW or town employees to help maintain the roads and such. All the men of the town performed various tasks towards our common good. My husband was a fence viewer who inspected everyone's fences to make sure they were at least 4 feet high and in good repair, so animals didn't stray and ruin other people's crops. My brother-in-law, Elias, was a pathmaster who inspected the roads and made sure each landowner was keeping up with the road in front of his property by filling in ruts and putting down gravel every spring. My husband was also a school trustee and a juror when Gold and I had a daughter, Sarah, in 1823. She was the light of our lives. Sadly, I only got to enjoy her company for a few years. I died in July of 1827, and I was only 25 years old. I was laid to rest in our newly formed cemetery, the land for which was given by the Collins family, whom you will hear from in a few minutes. My loving husband chose the inscription, "Her soul, we trust, has gone to rest, where it will forever be blessed." Gold remarried after a few years, and eventually the family moved to Michigan. He is buried there along with our daughter and her family. I, however, remain forever in the quiet shade of our dear little cemetery, among with our wonderful neighbors, such as the Woodlands, who you will hear from next.
Unlike my poor neighbor, Clarissa Richardson, I lived a very long life. I'm Mary Woodland, born in Wiltsey, which was a common name in these parts. I was born in 1760, which was right a long time ago now. That was before America was even a country. And as you can guess, I was just old enough to live through those times that tried men's souls. Our fight against the British for independence was long and hard, and it pitted neighbor against neighbor. It was not an easy time, but we were victorious, thanks to the likes of my dear husband Amos. Amos and I were married in January of 1775 in Massachusetts, just as our war for independence began. We were living in Sheffield, out in the western part of the state. When hostilities began, my Amos enlisted as a Minuteman and was called out occasionally on scouting expeditions for a few days at a time, every few months. In between, he would come home, and life on the farm would continue much as usual, except for the constant cloud of war hanging over us, of course. As the war went on, the conflict got closer to us, and Amos's service was needed for longer periods of time. He marched to Peekskill, New York, to guard a river to prevent the enemy from landing. He was in several small battles during those weeks he was gone. Another time, he marched up near Albany, where he and his company captured several Tories and sent them to prison camps. His most memorable service, however, came while serving in Captain Benjamin's company. They marched to Saratoga, where Amos and his fellow soldiers fought in the Battle of Saratoga and saw Burgoyne surrender. That was a great day, let me tell you that. The news was cause for much rejoicing. The war continued on for several years after that, but my Amos had done his part to put us on the path to freedom. I was so proud of him and all the men who served this country so faithfully to secure our freedom and independence. After the war, we moved just over the border to New York, where most of my 11 children were born. Yeah. Eventually, though, Amos wanted us to move even further west, out here to the frontier. Yes, this was the frontier in the early 1800s. Land was plentiful and cheap, and the soil was much better for farming. Amos came out to get us started. He walked here all the way. Most men did. It was a long, hard trip. The gun he had carried throughout the war became his best friend. He relied on it for food and protection on his long, lonely walk here. Once we were all here and settled, we built a beautiful home. It's actually located in Victor, not Perinton, just over the line in Fishers. But our closest neighbors were here in Perinton. And that's where we socialized and went to church. And here's a picture of our wonderful home. As you can imagine, I had my hands full raising 11 children. But unfortunately, I lost my lovely baby Mary when she was only 10 days old. And another two of my children died as toddlers, little Phoebe and little Timothy. Sadly, it was not uncommon to lose children to diseases back then. Life was difficult and full of heartaches at times. But there were plenty of good times, too. My Amos had a wonderful sense of humor, and he was a great storyteller. He was always able to cheer me up when I was down. He and I both lived into our 80s. I died in September of 1841, and he followed me the next year. We are both buried here in Bushnell Basin burying ground. And after 81 years, 11 children, and countless grandchildren, I feel that I've earned my eternal rest.
Did you know I've spent eternity right near the road named after my husband's family? In my day, it was called Ketchum Road. Today, it's just known as plain old Route 96. How dreary a name is that? Really? You'd think they could have come up with something else, or better yet, just left the name Ketchum. Well, my time here tonight is short, so I suppose I shouldn't bother you with my squabbles. My name is Alma Hetman Ketchum. When I was born in 1817, it was a time of great change in this area. Ketchum Road, a major stage route to link Rochesterville to Canandaigua and Victor, had opened just 5 years earlier. Then the Richardsons opened their inn and tavern in 1818. Clarissa, dear, I always wanted to enter your fine establishment, but Mama and Papa were so emphatic that it wasn't a proper place for young children, especially after the Erie Canal came along and so many travelers were bustling to and fro. Why, even after I married my dear husband, John Van Ness Ketchum, in 1837, I wasn't allowed to visit. John always said my hair, a handsome shade of auburn, would turn the heads of visiting canalers, and I'd end up swabbing the deck of some packet boat or traveling to a far-off land like Lockport. Oh well, my life, though not very adventurous, was happy. John and I were surrounded by his family, you know, the Ketchums of Ketchum Road. They began buying up land in these parts very early, and it got so you couldn't throw a stone without hitting a Ketchum family member. I was proud to become a member of the family, as they were all hardworking and very well respected around the basin. John supported our family in a fine style as a farmer. Sometimes we even had live-in help, which, as you can imagine, was extremely helpful for our large family. John and I had 7 children, although we lost Rob and Georgie as infants. My children were some of those who attended District Number 1 school, which was right out in front of the cemetery. Martha Collins will tell you more about that later. I lost John during the Great Blizzard of January 1886. Thankfully, he had completed a will to ensure my needs were met following his passing. Our sons, Franklin and Erasmus, cared for me many years thereafter. You see, I survived my husband by 23 years. By the time I passed on in 1909 at age 92, I had survived all but 3 of my children. It's been interesting to see the changes in the basin through many years. Well, I'll be watching as you pass on your way to Eastview Mall, driving right along Ketchum Road. You'll think of me now, won't you? Clarissa, dear, I'm on my way to the tavern to visit.
I must say, I don't approve of all this talk of Richardson's Tavern. In my estimation, alcoholic spirits are the work of the devil. During my lifetime, I worked hard to ensure that the people around me stayed on the straight and narrow. I'm Peter S Bonesteel, and I was pleased to be invited to the gathering this evening, even though I lived in Victor. The way I looked at it, I spent more of eternity in Bushnell Basin these past 138 years than I did while living my life in Victor. Besides, I was an important man, and it is only right to allow me to tell my story. Both my parents, Philip Bonesteel and Catherine Brzee, were very early settlers in this area. In fact, they are still descendants of the Brzee family living in Pittsford. My siblings and I were born in Woodstock, New York, but moved here as very young children. After growing to adulthood, I became a farmer, a quite successful farmer, if I say so myself. By 1870, my farm was valued at $30,000. I'm told that it's equivalent to over $500,000 in today's currency. 11 horses resided in my barns, a record that only those of Bowden boys could come close to matching. The only thing money couldn't buy me was happiness. I wedded my first wife, Mary Burkholder, in 1834. To our great sorrow, Mary was unable to bear any children. The year after Mary's death, I married Octavia Morgan, who was 23 years my junior. She gave birth to our only child, Frank, several years later. Through the years, I was very active in the community. I served as Victortown supervisor and for many years was president of the excise board, which levied duties on goods. In 1868, I was elected as Ontario County delegate to the Republican State Convention, held that year in Syracuse. And though I was not a member of St. Paul's Universalist Church, as many of my neighbors were, I did support their worthy causes. As I mentioned before, I was a temperance man. Although I was greatly perturbed to learn a beverage establishment was operating out of my former home, it was good to hear that they do not serve the devil's drinks. I entered the afterlife in 1881, just a few weeks shy of my 71st birthday. I don't mind my time here. It's peaceful enough, at least until those raucous ladies come back from Clarissa Richardson's tavern.
My family's history is tied up with both the building of the canal, which you've heard about, and the local school, which I'll tell you about. I was born Patti Bowden in 1806. My real name is Martha, but I have always gone by Patti. I married Harkscaline Collins in 1831 when I was 25 years old. We moved here to Perinton to live on land my father-in-law, Cyprian Collins, owned. My father-in-law had moved his family to East Bloomfield from Connecticut in the late 18th century. Cyprian was a contractor who helped plan and build the Erie Canal here in western New York, and he worked on the Great Embankment, which Clarissa told you about earlier. He bought 150 acres of land along the Canandaigua Coach Road just outside of the basin around 1810. It bordered Irondequoit Creek. Harkscaline and I built a beautiful home there, almost across from where Garnsey Road meets Route 96. It is a lovely example of a Greek Revival-style home, which became popular here in western New York in the 1800s. My kitchen had a wonderful wide fireplace and multiple baking ovens. I had a built-in set kettle for doing laundry, which was located between the kitchen and the woodshed and was attached to the kitchen's chimney system. In fact, my set kettle was used as a model for the restoration of a similar system in a house at the Genesee Country Museum. Outside, we have a hip-roofed privy. No reason that something practical can't be stylish, too. We even had our own brick smokehouse to cure our meats. Our home was lovely and lacked for nothing. My husband, Harkscaline, was active in the Whig Party and attended the 1852 Whig Convention in Baltimore. His goal was to nominate someone other than President Fillmore, who had supported the Runaway Slave Act, to be our party's presidential candidate for the next election. We were adamantly anti-slavery and wouldn't support a candidate that supported slavery. In fact, our beautiful home was even a stop on the Underground Railroad for a time. Harkscaline's brother Hiram also lived with us, and he donated 1 acre of land to be used for both the cemetery and the building of the school. Communities have need of both. That's just a part of life. The school was built out near the street, while the burying ground was located behind it. Over the years, there have been over 200 people buried in it. That may seem like a small cemetery to some, but it represents several generations of all of our pioneer families from Bushnell Basin. Our schoolhouse was the first established in town and was therefore known as District 1. The original building was a simple frame structure, sparsely furnished, as was common in the day. There was a winter term of 20 weeks, and generally, the teacher during the term was a man because the older boys were in attendance and required a firm hand. There was also a 12-week summer term, for which a woman was generally hired because the older boys were often in the fields during that term. In 1837, our little school had 38 students. 8 years later, there were 82 students, and by 1851, attendance had climbed to 107, which strained the limits of the building, to be sure. So in 1866, the building was rebuilt as a larger brick building. Here's a photo that shows the burying grounds right behind the school, and another that shows what it looked like from the road in the 1960s. Here is another photo showing some children with their sheep. This was a farming community, to be sure. Learning to care for your animals was as important as learning your ABCs. Our little district school, built on land given by my husband's family, was in use until 1947, when the area voted to centralize with the Pittsford School District. After that, it was used as a community center and various other things until 1978, when the roof collapsed during a snowstorm. Sadly, our lovely little schoolhouse was torn down. Only the burying ground remains today. My husband and I had 4 sons together, some of whom are buried here with us. My husband died in 1872, while I lived another 13 years before passing on to my great reward in 1886. We saw this area grow an astonishing amount from the time we moved here in the 1830s until the 1880s, and I am sure you can all say the same thing about the changes in town in your lifetimes. Some changes are for the good, while some, well, let's just say I'm enjoying my rest in the burying ground, content to watch the world go by while I enjoy the quiet near the creek.
Who here likes cider? Well, my family, the McCords, owned the orchards and ran cider mills in Bushnell Basin for many years. I am Joseph McCord. I was born here in 1870. I attended school number 1. Thank you, Collins family, for donating the land. My 4 siblings and I got a fine education there. It was good enough to get me into Cornell University, where I continued my education. I was raised on the family farm, and my parents, Joseph and Sarah McCord, had a beautiful farm up on Guernsey Hill, which expanded in size over the years until it covered more than, We raised the usual crops, such as corn, oats, rye, wheat, and potatoes. We also had a few dairy cows, but our main product was apples. We had about 10 acres of apple orchards. We left about 30 acres as woodlands, which to this day are named after us, McCord Woods. Maybe some of you have hiked through there. My father sold apples, but he also milled many into cider. Here's a 1902 map showing our cider mill in the basin. By this time, my father had moved into a house across the street from the mill and let my brother, Levi, run the farm. Notice the bridge, notice the bridge over the canal is running behind Richardson's house. It was shortly after that the bridge was moved to its present-day location in front of its canal house. And for some reason, they were building it at such an angle you couldn't see who was at the other side. I don't know what idea that was. The newly constructed trolley bridge was built at Richardson's, or behind Richardson's, and the abutments are still there today. My parents are well-known and hard-working farmers, but the reputation was built on another trait, being faithful children of God. My mother and farmer was a preacher, and both my parents made it in their lifelong mission to help grow God's kingdom here on earth. The canal brought all kinds of rough, seedy people to the area, and our little church in the basin had started to combat the drinking, gambling, and other bad habits that came with it. The church, however, was changing denominations and leadership for every few years. My parents felt it wasn't providing enough stability to the community. So around 1887, they began a mission church right in our living room. One of my father's first acts was to baptize all of us kids in the Irondequoit Creek on a Sunday afternoon. My father was so full of the Spirit, the neighbors weren't sure what to make of him. He continued to lead Bible study and prayer services, and over time, he and my mother had a faithful following. I was a believer too, and decided when I was 20 to become an overseas missionary and spread God's word to the unchurched. My parents were proud of my decision, but it was a sad day when I said my goodbyes to my family and friends. I wasn't sure if I'd ever see them again. Here's a photo taken of me shortly after I left. My plan was to head west to California, where I would then set sail for the Samoan Islands. Sadly, God had other plans for me. I was trying to ford a river in Colorado, which was swollen by the spring runoff. The water was too swift for my horse, and both he and I were swept away and quickly drowned. My poor father came to Colorado to retrieve my body and brought me home here to Perinton and laid the rest near my family's farm. Although I never made it to Samoa, I hope that the way I lived and conducted myself throughout the life made me a shining example of a God-fearing man, an example to all who knew me. Now I am waiting my eternal reward in the comfort of my plot here in our lovely little burying ground in my beloved Perinton. Sorry, it's a tad swing.
Yeah. When I came to this country from Germany in the late 1830s, people couldn't understand my accent. My name is Jacob Mackley, but they heard Mackley. So that became my Americanized surname. My skills are all I really brought from my old country. I was a cooper, creating barrels, crates, casks, buckets, troughs, anything you need. But there were many opportunities for me here in America. I lived for a time in East Bloomfield with my wife and son. But after my wife died, I moved to Bushnell Basin, where I have resided and since and will forevermore. When the war broke out in 1861, I wanted to enlist and aid my new country in the time of peril. However, the recruiters didn't want me because I was too old at 41. The following year, however, I went to join the 13th New York Volunteer Infantry. They had suffered severe losses at the Battle of Bull Run and were in desperate need of new recruits. I told them I was 35. And, well, they didn't look too hard and accepted me. Now, the 13th suffered more than a few casualties in December at Fredericksburg, but I was fortunately not amongst the wounded. In June of '63, the remaining men of the 13th were turned over to the 140th New York Volunteer Infantry to complete our service. A few weeks later, we found ourselves at the very heart of the war, Gettysburg. You may have heard of my commanding officer, Colonel Patrick O'Rourke. We were given orders to rush the crest of a small hill called Little Round Top to push back old Johnny Reb, who was quickly ascending the hill. They continued assault after assault on us, and the fighting was some of the fiercest I had ever known. As Colonel O'Rourke grabbed the regimental colors and stood atop the rock to urge us on, he was shot in the neck and fell dead at our feet. Colonel O'Rourke was one of the bravest men I've ever had the privilege of knowing, and his passing was a blow to all who knew him. The 140th participated in several large engagements following that sad day at Gettysburg. The Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, just to name a few. I mustered out at the end of the war relatively unscathed and was gleeful to return to my house and orchards in the basin. I married again to a woman named Helen, who was 13 years my junior. She had a young daughter, Anna, who I loved as my own. The years following the wars were good ones. I joined the Fairport Post as a Grand Army of the Republic, an organization dedicated to war veterans and their needs. For many years, I was in charge of Memorial Day exercises and teaching the children of District No. 1 School about patriotism and planting flowers and flags on the graves of our exalted soldiers, buried here at Bushnell Basin Cemetery. There are 6 of us spending eternity in this hallowed ground. Now, my proudest moment has to be the gathering of old soldiers I hosted in my orchards in 1895. More than 200 veterans and their families from the basin and adjoining towns attended. We reminisced, laughed, and wept together at our memories from the war and those we lost. Even though 30 years had gone by, our age and infirmities didn't erase our recollections of those gone by times. Following my death at 1911, at age 91, I was laid to rest here amongst my friends and comrades in arms. Thank you for listening to the fine souls this beautiful evening.
If I could get all of you to come stand up here, please. I'm Suzanne Lee. I always help Vicki with the cemetery tours. And I just wanted to introduce all of our actors today, and we can give them yet another round of applause because they did such a great job. Starting on the end, we have Bianca Louie, who played Clarissa Richardson, followed, Jordan Bagley, who played Mary Wooden. Allison Prophet, who played Alma Ketchum. Will Prophet, who played Peter Bonesteel. Avery Stadler, who played Patti Collins. Tristan Bauer, who played Joseph McCord. And Tristan Burley, who played Jacob Megerly. Thank you all so much for coming. I know this is a little short. These old cemeteries, it's hard to find information. So this was all you get out of this one, but come next year and we'll give you a little bit longer program for sure. Thanks.